Sophie thought she was saving a drowning victim. She was wrong. She was waking a monster. When she dragged the massive, scarred body from the churning surf during a hurricane, her only thought was protocol: airway, breathing, circulation. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and pressed her lips to his to breathe life into his cold lungs. She didn't expect the jolt of electricity that welded their souls together. She didn't expect the corpse to snap its eyes open, glowing a lethal predator red, and pin her to the sand with terrifying speed. And she certainly didn't expect the first words out of his mouth to be a growled, earth-shaking command that claimed her very existence. Mine. Now, with assassins on their tail and a mating bond burning through her veins, Sophie realizes the storm in the ocean was nothing compared to the storm she just invited into her life. Welcome back to Raven's Library. I hope you're all having a wonderful holiday season and staying cozy as we wrap up the year. Before we dive into today's steamy werewolf romance, and trust me, this one gets hot, I want to do a little roll call for our pack. I absolutely love seeing how far these stories travel. So, do me a favor. Pause the video for just a second, head down to the comments section, and let me know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Whether you're bundled up in the snow or enjoying a tropical breeze, drop your city or your country's flag below so I can say hi. It's amazing to see how global this community has become. All right, roll call done? Great. Now, get comfortable, because an Alpha King is about to wake up. Chapter 1. The ocean didn't just roar, it screamed, hurling 30-foot waves of black water against the Santa Monica pier pilings like it had a personal vendetta against Los Angeles infrastructure. Idiot tourists, Sophie muttered, squinting through the salt spray whipping against the plexiglass windows of Lifeguard Tower 4. If one more influencer tries to get a storm selfie, I'm letting Darwin take the wheel. She shoved her binoculars into her waterproof duffel bag. It was past midnight. The storm warning was upgraded to severe, and her shift had technically ended 2 hours ago. But Sophie Rollin hadn't survived 5 years as a rogue wolf hiding in plain sight by being careless. The storm masked sense, which meant it was the perfect time for things that went bump in the night to wash up where they didn't belong. She reached for the zipper of her windbreaker when she saw it. A dark, jagged shape bobbing in the violent surf, 50 yards out. Most people would mistake it for a log or a clump of kelp. Sophie's enhanced vision, sharpened by the wolf she kept locked deep inside her rib cage, saw the truth. It was a torso. A massive, broad-shouldered torso, attached to a body that was currently getting pulverized by the Pacific. "Damn it," she hissed, grabbing her rescue can, the red plastic float that was the only weapon she allowed herself these days. On my day off. Seriously. She kicked open the tower door, the wind instantly trying to tear it off its hinges. The rain felt like gravel against her skin. Sophie didn't hesitate. She hit the sand running, her bare feet digging into the cold, wet grit. The water temperature was freezing, enough to induce hypothermia in a human within minutes. Lucky for the guy drowning out there, Sophie ran hot. She dove under the first crushing wave, the salt water stinging her eyes. The current was a beast, ripping at her legs, trying to drag her out to sea. She fought it with efficient, powerful strokes, her muscles burning. When she reached him, she realized her mistake. He wasn't just big. He was a titan. He floated face down, dead weight, his skin as cold as the grave. She hooked her arm around his chest to flip him over, and nearly sank under his density. He was heavy, unnaturally heavy. Muscle density that thick usually meant one thing in her world, but she pushed the thought away. "Don't be dead, big guy," she grunted, spitting out seawater as a wave crashed over them. "I don't want to do the paperwork." She side-stroked back to shore, fighting the ocean for every inch. By the time her knees hit the sand, her lungs were burning. She dragged him up the beach, his heels carving deep furrows in the wet earth, well past the high tide line. She collapsed next to him, chest heaving. Lightning cracked the sky open, illuminating him in a strobe light flash. Sophie froze. He was covered in wounds, angry, jagged slashes that weren't from the rocks. They were burns. Silver burns. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't a surfer. This was a war casualty. And looking at the sheer size of him, he wasn't a foot soldier. He wasn't breathing. Sophie swore, shaking the water from her hair. She positioned herself over him, interlocking her fingers on his sternum. "Come on," she whispered, starting compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. No gasp, no pulse. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and took a deep breath. She lowered her mouth to his, sealing the connection to force air into his lungs. Chapter 2. The moment their lips touched, the world exploded. It wasn't a spark. It was a supernova. A shockwave of golden, searing heat blasted from his cold lips into hers, slamming into her chest with the force of a sledgehammer. It wasn't just air she pushed into him. It was vitality. It was soul. Sophie gasped, pulling back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The storm seemed to go silent, the roar of the ocean fading into a dull buzz. Beneath her, the corpse inhaled. It was a jagged, wet sound, like a vacuum seal breaking. Then his eyes snapped open. They weren't human. They were crimson, glowing, radioactive red circles of pure dominance that cut through the darkness. Before Sophie could scramble back, a hand the size of a dinner plate shot up and wrapped around her throat. He didn't squeeze to choke. He squeezed to hold. In a blur of motion that shouldn't have been possible for a man who was clinically dead 10 seconds ago, he flipped their positions. Sophie's back hit the wet sand hard, the air leaving her lungs in a whoosh. He loomed over her, dripping wet, his hair plastering to a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and bad intentions. He lowered his head, burying his nose into the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. The sound he made was terrifying, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through her entire body. He pulled back, those red eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "Mine." The word wasn't spoken. It was detonated. It carried the weight of an alpha command, designed to make lesser wolves roll over and bare their throats. Sophie didn't roll over. She got annoyed. "Get off me!" she shouted, driving her knee sharply into his groin. The giant blinked, the red in his eyes flickering with confusion. He grunted, his grip on her loosening just enough. "You hit me?" His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. "I just saved your life, you ungrateful lumberjack," Sophie snapped, shoving his massive chest. He didn't budge an inch, but he did look slightly less murderous and slightly more baffled. "Personal space. Learn it." "You smell like salt and defiance," he murmured, looking at her as if she were a riddle he intended to solve by eating it. You are my... I am a lifeguard who is 5 seconds away from leaving you here for the seagulls, she interrupted, trying to scramble out from under him. The M word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She refused to acknowledge it. Bond or no bond, she wasn't dealing with this. Suddenly, the man's head whipped toward the pier above them. His nostrils flared. The red glow in his eyes sharpened, losing the confusion and regaining the killer edge. "Quiet," he hissed. Sophie heard it then. The crunch of tires on gravel, heavy doors slamming. Above them, on the pier, the distinct click-clack of assault rifles being racked. "Target is down on the beach." A voice drifted down, mechanical and cold. "Double tap. Burn the body." The giant looked down at her. "Leave. Now." "They have guns," Sophie whispered, her survival instincts overriding her annoyance. "I know," he growled, trying to push himself up, but his arms trembled. The silver poison was still working through his system. He collapsed back onto her, his heavy head landing on her shoulder with a wet thud. "Damn it." "Great," Sophie muttered, looking at the approaching flashlight beams cutting through the rain. "I save the guy, I get the guy, and now I have to carry the guy. This is the worst first date in history." Chapter 3. "Can you stand?" Sophie hissed, shoving his shoulder. "I am King Lyall," he slurred, his weight crushing her into the sand. "I do not crawl." "Well, King Lyall, unless you want to be a majestic corpse, you need to move your royal ass," she grunted, wiggling out from under him. She grabbed his arm, which was thicker than her thigh, and hauled. He stumbled upright, swaying like a drunk skyscraper. He was losing consciousness again, the adrenaline of the bond fading as the silver toxicity clawed back. 3 figures appeared at the railing of the pier 20 feet above them. Silencers coughed. Foot, foot, foot. Sand geysered up inches from Sophie's bare feet. "Move!" She grabbed the king's waist and dragged him toward the shadow of the lifeguard tower pilings. He was heavy, clumsy, and bleeding black ooze from his shoulder, but he tried to shield her with his body, stumbling between her and the shooters. "Stop!" he commanded the air, weak and useless. "Save the heroics for the biopic," Sophie snapped. She shoved him behind a concrete pillar. She needed a weapon. She had a plastic rescue can and a whistle. Not exactly SEAL Team 6 gear. Wait, the emergency kit in the tower. "Stay here," she ordered. "Don't die, don't roar. Just exist quietly." She scrambled up the ladder, bullets chipping the wood around her hands. She dove into the tower, ripping the emergency box off the wall. She grabbed the heavy-duty flare gun. It was old, clunky, and held 1 shot. It would have to do. She slid back down the ladder. The shooters were rappelling down from the pier now, black-clad shapes dropping like spiders. They smelled like wet dog and gunpowder. Mercenaries. Shifters working for coin. The first one landed 10 feet away, raising his rifle. Sophie didn't hesitate. She didn't aim for him. She aimed for the sand right in front of his night vision goggles. Boom! The magnesium flare ignited with the brightness of a miniature sun. The mercenary screamed, clutching his eyes, blinded by the sudden white-hot flash amplifying through his sensitive optics. "My eyes! I can't see!" Sophie didn't wait. She grabbed Lyall, who was watching her with a look of drugged adoration. "My jeep. Now!" They stumbled through the soft sand toward the parking lot.
Sophie shoved him into the passenger seat of her battered, doorless Wrangler. He barely fit. His knees were practically against the dashboard. "Seat belt!" she yelled, vaulting into the driver's seat and turning the key. The engine roared, a comforting, mechanical sound. "You blinded him," Lyall mumbled, touching the dashboard like it was an alien artifact. "Vicious. I like it." "Hold on." Sophie slammed the gearshift into reverse just as the other two mercenaries reached the parking lot. Bullets shattered the side mirror. Sophie didn't take the road. She spun the wheel hard to the left, driving straight over the curb, through a chain-link fence, and down into a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the highway. The Jeep bucked and slammed, mud flying everywhere. Lyall groaned, his head hitting the roll bar. "Sorry!" Sophie yelled over the engine. "Suspension is shot!" "Who are you?" Lyall demanded, staring at her profile as she navigated the treacherous mud track with the skill of a rally driver. "I'm the woman saving your life," she said, jaw set. "And you owe me a new mirror." The Seabreeze Motel smelled like lemon disinfectant and regret. It was perfect. Sophie kicked the door of room 12 open, practically carrying Lyall inside. He was deteriorating fast. The silver was eating him from the inside out. She dumped him onto the singular, sagging mattress. He let out a roar of pain that shook the thin walls. "Quiet!" Sophie hissed, slamming the door and engaging the flimsy chain lock. "You want to call room service or the death squad?" She ran to the bathroom, grabbing a handful of clean towels. When she came back, Lyall was trying to rip his soaked shirt off. The fabric was stuck to the wound on his shoulder. "Let me," she said, her voice dropping the sarcasm for a moment. She pushed his hands away. His skin was burning up. She peeled the fabric back. It was ugly. A puckered black hole in his deltoid, oozing dark liquid. "Silver," Lyall gritted out, his teeth clenched so hard she heard them creak. "Hollow point. It's still inside." "I don't have medical equipment," Sophie said, panic fluttering in her chest. "I have a first aid kit with Band-Aids and tweezers." "Do it," he commanded. He looked at her, his red eyes dimming to a muddy brown. "Dig it out, or I die." Sophie swallowed hard. She grabbed the tweezers from her bag and a bottle of cheap vodka from the minibar. She poured the alcohol over the tweezers and then over his wound. He didn't scream, but the sound that left his throat was a low, animalistic keening that made the hair on her arms stand up. I'm sorry," she whispered, probing the wound. The metal clicked against the tweezers. "Don't apologize," he panted, sweat beading on his forehead. "Just get it." She found the slug. With a sickening squelch, she yanked it out and dropped it into the water glass on the nightstand. Lyall slumped back against the headboard, chest heaving. Then, the magic happened. The moment the silver was gone, steam began to rise from the wound. The flesh knit together, cells regenerating at a visible speed. Within seconds, there was nothing but a faint pink scar. Lyall took a deep breath, his power returning in a rush. He sat up, the bed springs groaning in protest. He looked at his shoulder, then at Sophie. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, thick, hot. Sophie took a step back, hitting the dresser. The adrenaline was fading, leaving something else in its wake. The bond. Now that he wasn't dying, the pull was undeniable. It felt like a hook in her navel, dragging her toward him. Lyall stood up. He towered over her in the small room, wet, shirtless, and terrifyingly healthy. He stalked toward her, crowding her space until her back was pressed against the mirror. "You saved me," he murmured, bracing his hands on the dresser on either side of her, trapping her. "I did," Sophie managed, her voice shaky. "Now back up." "I am a king," he said, leaning down until his lips were an inch from her ear. "I do not take orders, little wolf. I give them." Sophie's eyes narrowed. The fear evaporated, replaced by the same stubbornness that made her leave her pack years ago. She placed a hand flat on his bare, rock-hard chest and pushed. He didn't move, but he looked surprised. "Look, Your Highness," she said, staring him dead in the eye. "I just dug a bullet out of you with eyebrow tweezers in a motel that charges by the hour. You're not a king right now. You're a liability, and if you growl at me one more time, I'm going to put that bullet back in." Lyle stared at her. The silence stretched, tense and electric. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. He threw his head back and laughed, a rich, deep sound that seemed to warm the cold, ugly room. "A queen," he said, looking at her with dangerous appreciation. "You command a king. Dangerous habit, Sophie." "How do you know my name?" she asked, stiffening. He tapped the side of his nose. "I know your scent. I know your heartbeat. And now—" He stepped back, his eyes glowing that possessive red again. "I know where you belong." "I belong in bed," Sophie said, ducking under his arm and grabbing her keys. "Alone. I'm getting ice." She opened the door to leave, needing air, needing to escape the suffocating heat of him. She made it to the vending machine outside before the pain hit. It wasn't a cramp. It was an agony that felt like her heart was being ripped out of her chest. She gasped, doubling over, dropping her keys. Inside the room, she heard a thud, as if Lyle had fallen to his knees. Bond sickness. She couldn't leave. "You have got to be kidding me," Sophie groaned, clutching her chest as she stared at the door she had just walked out of. Chapter 5. The invisible leash snapped back into place the moment Sophie crossed the threshold of room 12. The agonizing, crushing weight on her chest vanished instantly, replaced by a rush of endorphins so potent it made her knees buckle. She stumbled into the room, gasping for air like a diver surfacing from the deep, and slammed the door shut behind her. It was a trap. A biological, magical, unfair trap. "I see you decided to stay." A deep voice rumbled from the shadows. Sophie looked up, glaring. Lyle was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking infuriatingly composed for a man who had been bleeding out 20 minutes ago. He had raided the minibar. He held a tiny, overpriced bag of peanuts between two fingers that looked capable of crushing rocks, popping them into his mouth with the casual elegance of an aristocrat dining at a banquet. "I didn't decide anything," Sophie snapped, leaning against the door to catch her breath. "I walked 10 feet and felt like I was having a cardiac arrest. What did you do to me?" "I did nothing," Lyle said, dusting salt from his hands. He stood up, and the room immediately felt smaller. The transformation was complete. The wounded, desperate creature she had dragged from the ocean was gone. In his place stood a predator in his prime. His skin was flawless, the scar tissue from the silver burns already fading to faint white lines. He moved with a lethal grace that screamed apex power. "Our souls recognized each other, Sophie. Biology did the rest. Separation is unpleasant." "Unpleasant?" Sophie laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. It felt like someone was blending my internal organs. "For me as well," he admitted, his eyes tracking her movement as she walked to the other side of the room to put distance between them. "But I knew you would return. You had no choice." "I always have a choice," she muttered, grabbing her bag. "I'm just figuring out the logistics." Lyle stepped into the light of the flickering bathroom bulb, He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Stop fighting it. You saved my life. You bonded to me. Now you must know who it is you have claimed." He straightened his spine, his chin lifting imperiously. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with static. "I am Lyle Tala," he announced, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with the weight of authority. "Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, warlord of the Western Territories, and the High King of all shifters." He paused, clearly waiting for the reaction, the gasp, the kneel, the tremble of awe. Sophie stared at him. She blinked once. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled receipt, and slapped it onto his bare chest. "That's fantastic, Your Highness," she deadpanned. "That means you can afford the bill. This room is $80 a night, plus the peanuts you just ate. You owe me." Lyle looked down at the paper stuck to his pectoral muscle, then back up at her, his expression bordering on bewildered. "I just told you I ruled the supernatural world, and you are concerned with
Currency? I'm concerned with the fact that I have rent to pay and a job I'm currently missing," Sophie said, crossing her arms to mask the fact that her hands were shaking. His proximity was intoxicating. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to go to him, to touch him, to let that golden heat consume her. She fought it with every ounce of her stubbornness. "Look, Lyle, King, whatever. I saved you. You're healed. We're even. I'm not joining a pack. I'm not becoming a queen. I left that life for a reason." Lyle's amusement vanished. He took 2 long strides, closing the gap between them. Sophie backed up until her legs hit the edge of the mattress. "You think this is a transaction?" he growled softly, towering over her. "You think you can just walk away from a mate bond because it is inconvenient for your schedule?" "I think I'm a free woman living in the 21st century," Sophie shot back, tilting her head up to meet his intense red gaze. "I don't belong to anyone." "You are wrong," Lyle said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The absolute certainty in his tone was far scarier than any yell. He placed a hand on the wall behind her head, boxing her in. "The moment your breath entered my lungs, the choice was made. You are not just a lifeguard anymore, Sophie. You are the target of my enemies. You are the weakness of a king." "Then let me go," she whispered, her heart hammering against his chest. "Never," he vowed, his eyes searching hers, burning with a mix of hunger and possessiveness that made her breath hitch. "We leave at dawn for the capital. You will stand by my side. You will help me reclaim my throne." "And if I say no?" Lyle leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Then I will carry you," he murmured. "You saved the king, Sophie. You belong to the king now, and I do not share my things." Chapter 6. Dawn could kiss her ass. Sophie didn't wait for the sun. She waited exactly 45 minutes for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of deep sleep to echo from the bed where the Alpha King lay. The moment she was sure he was out, she grabbed her keys, her bag, and her boots, moving with the silent, practiced stealth of a woman who had spent 5 years avoiding detection. She slipped out the door, the cool night air hitting her face like a blessing. Lyle Tala might be the king of shifters, but he clearly underestimated the determination of a woman with a maxed-out credit card and a strong aversion to monarchy. "Belong to the king," she mocked under her breath, jamming the key into the Jeep's ignition. "Buddy, the only thing I belong to is the IRS." The engine roared to life. She didn't look back at room 12.
She slammed the gear shift into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind her tires. Her plan was simple: drive until the tank was empty, then switch cars, switch names, and disappear into the sprawling chaos of Las Vegas. Mile 1 was easy. She felt lighter, the suffocating pressure of Lyall's presence fading in the rearview mirror. Mile 2 brought the headache. It started as a dull throb behind her eyes, like a caffeine withdrawal kick, but she ignored it. She turned the radio up, drowning out the nagging instinct in her gut that screamed, "Wrong way." "Shut up," she told her wolf. "We're going to Vegas. We like buffets." Mile 3 was where the trouble started. The throb became a spike. Her skin began to itch, a crawling sensation like 1,000 ants marching under her dermis. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead, despite the heater blasting full bore. "Just stress," she gasped, her knuckles white. "Just adrenaline crash." By mile 4, Sophie was screaming. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of agony. It felt as though an invisible, serrated hook had been embedded in her solar plexus and was being yanked backward with hydraulic force. Her vision blurred, black spots dancing in front of the headlights. Every cell in her body went into revolt. Her heart hammered an erratic, terrified rhythm, not beating so much as spasming. She slammed on the brakes, the Jeep screeching to a halt on the dark shoulder of the highway. Sophie threw the door open and fell out onto the asphalt, dry heaving. It felt like her blood was boiling, turning to acid in her veins. She curled into a ball, clutching her chest, gasping for air that refused to fill her lungs. "Mate," her inner wolf howled, a sound of pure desolation. "Go back. Dying. We are dying." "No!" Sophie grit out, clawing at the pavement. "I am not doing this." She tried to crawl forward, away from the motel. The pain spiked so hard she blacked out for a second. When her vision cleared, she realized she wasn't just sick. She was fading. Her limbs felt numb, the connection to her own body severing. It wasn't a metaphor. The bond sickness was literal. Without the connection to the other half of her soul, her system was shutting down. She had two choices: die right here on the side of Route 66 like roadkill, or go back to the arrogance in room 12. "I hate him," she sobbed, tears of pain and frustration leaking from her eyes. "I hate him so much." With the last of her strength, she dragged herself back into the driver's seat. Putting the Jeep in a U-turn was the hardest physical thing she had ever done. But the moment the nose of the car pointed back toward the motel, the agony receded slightly. It was still there, a dull roar, but she could breathe. The drive back was a humiliating crawl. Every mile closer she got, the stronger she felt. The nausea vanished, the headache cleared. By the time she pulled into the Seabreeze Motel parking lot, she was physically perfect, but emotionally homicidal. She killed the engine and stormed toward room 12. She didn't use the key. She kicked the door. It swung open. Lyall hadn't moved. He was leaning against the headboard, arms crossed, awake. He looked fresh, rested, and completely unbothered. He watched her storm in, his expression maddeningly neutral. "You made it 4 miles, he noted, glancing at the cheap digital clock on the nightstand. "Impressive. Most new mates collapse after 2. "You knew," Sophie seethed, slamming the door so hard the Do Not Disturb sign fell off. "You let me leave knowing it would cripple me." "I told you, Sophie," Lyall said, swinging his legs off the bed and standing up. He walked toward her, and the closer he got, the more her body sang with relief, betraying her anger. He stopped inches from her, looking down with a mix of pity and triumph. You can run from the hunters. You can run from your past, but you cannot run from me. He reached out, his thumb brushing the tear track on her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of pleasure through her that made her knees weak. We are tethered, he whispered. Now get some sleep. We have a kingdom to burn down in the morning. If you touch that dial one more time, Your Majesty, I will drive this car into a bridge abutment. Sophie didn't take her eyes off the rain-slicked highway. They had been on the road for 4 hours, and Lyle Tala, the terrifying alpha king of all shifters, had spent 3 of them trying to understand the concept of top 40 radio. It is repetitive, Lyle grumbled, withdrawing his hand from the dashboard of the Jeep. He looked cramped. His knees were pressed against the glove compartment, and his head brushed the canvas roof every time they hit a pothole. Why is this woman singing about her ex-lover? If he displeased her, she should simply hunt him. It's called a breakup anthem, Lyle. Humans don't hunt their exes. We write passive-aggressive songs and monetize our trauma. Sophie signaled aggressively to merge lanes. Now sit back. We need ground rules. If I'm driving you to San Francisco, we do things my way. I do not follow rules, Sophie. I make them. Not in my car, you don't. Rule 1. You don't growl at toll booth operators. You scared that poor guy back in Santa Barbara so bad he dropped my change. Lyle scoffed, looking out the window at the passing blur of the California coastline. He looked at you with disrespect. He looked at me because I was handing him a 20, Sophie corrected. Rule 2. We stop for coffee. Real coffee, not whatever raw meat slurry you probably drink for breakfast. And Rule 3. You tell me the truth. Is this bond sickness going to get worse? Lyle went silent. The air in the Jeep grew heavy, the playful bickering evaporating instantly. He turned to look at her, his red eyes dim in the shadows of the passing streetlights. It will stabilize, he said quietly, as long as we are within a few feet of each other. But the longer we resist the consummation of the bond, the more volatile our instincts will become. My wolf wants to claim you, Sophie. And your wolf, she wants to be claimed. You can deny it with your words, but I can smell her longing. Sophie gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Keep your nose to yourself. She reached out to turn up the volume, desperate to drown out the sudden, thick tension filling the small cabin. Breaking news coming out of the Northern Territories. The news anchor's voice cut through the static, urgent and grim. Authorities are reporting a massive shift in leadership within the hidden sectarian groups. Sources confirm that the long-standing leader, Lyle Tala, has been confirmed dead following a coup attempt led by his brother, Corvick Tala. Sophie slammed on the brakes, the Jeep fishtailing slightly before skidding to a halt on the gravel shoulder. Lyle didn't move. He stared at the radio, his face a mask of stone. Corvick Tala has declared a new era of purification, the voice continued. All loyalists to the former regime have been given 24 hours to surrender or face execution. Silence stretched in the car, louder than the storm outside. He thinks I'm dead, Lyle said softly. The temperature in the Jeep plummeted. Frost began to creep across the dashboard. It wasn't a figure of speech. The sheer force of his killing intent was sucking the heat out of the air. Lyle, Sophie whispered, seeing the veins in his neck bulge. The window. You're going to break the window." "He is hunting my people," Lyle snarled, a sound that was less human and more tectonic plate shifting. "He is slaughtering them because of my failure." "Then we stop him," Sophie said, her voice cutting through his rage. She reached out, grabbing his freezing cold hand. The contact sizzled, grounding him. "We don't mourn you, Lyle. We resurrect you. But we can't do that if you blow my car up with your anger issues. We need a plan, and we need sleep. I know a place." Lyle looked at their joined hands, then up at her fierce, determined face. The frost on the dashboard melted. "Drive," he commanded. But this time, it sounded less like an order and more like a plea. The safe house wasn't much of a house. It was a glorified shed deep in the redwood forest, miles from the main highway. It belonged to an old contact of Sophie's, a paranoid survivalist who owed her a favor. But looking at the layer of dust on the floor, no one had been here in years. "It smells like wet pine and abandonment," Lyle noted, ducking his head to enter the front door. He filled the small space entirely. "It's off the grid," Sophie said, dropping her duffel bag. She shivered. The air inside was colder than the air outside. "Check the generator out back. I'll check the supplies." 10 minutes later, the verdict was in. The generator was dead, the fireplace flue was blocked, and the only source of heat was a single moth-eaten wool blanket on a twin-sized mattress in the corner. Sophie stood looking at the bed. It was barely big enough for her. Lyle would probably hang off 3 sides of it. "I will take the floor," Lyle said, standing behind her. "Don't be an idiot," Sophie sighed, rubbing her arms. She could already see her breath misting in the air. "It's 30 degrees in here. With the bond sickness, our systems are already stressed. If you sleep on that freezing floor, your healing will stall. And I'm not dragging your heavy carcass out of here if you get pneumonia." "I do not get pneumonia," Lyle scoffed. "I am the king of get in the bed, Lyle." She kicked off her boots and crawled onto the mattress, curling up against the wall, leaving him the outer edge. She pulled the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. Lyle hesitated. For a man who had faced armies and usurpers, the sight of the small, fierce woman in the bed seemed to unnerve him. Slowly, he removed his boots and lay down. The mattress dipped significantly under his weight, rolling Sophie backward until her spine collided with his chest. She stiffened. "Relax," Lyle murmured, his voice rumbling directly against her back. "I am not going to ravish you in a freezing shed, Sophie. I have standards." "Good," she squeaked, trying to ignore the fact that he was a literal furnace. The heat radiating off him was incredible. Within seconds, she stopped shivering. Instinctively, she relaxed, pressing closer to the warmth. He didn't pull away. Instead, his arm came over her waist, heavy, possessive, and solid. He pulled her flush against him, tangling his legs with hers. It was intimate, dangerously so. It wasn't the frantic, magical heat of the spark. It was the slow, steady burn of comfort. "Why did you leave?" Lyle whispered into the darkness after a long silence. "The pack life. You have the heart of a warrior. Why hide as a lifeguard?" Sophie stared at the peeling wallpaper. "Because warriors are just pawns for kings," she whispered back. "I got tired of bleeding for wars I didn't start. I wanted to save lives, not take them." Lyle's arm tightened around her waist. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. "I have started many wars," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I thought power was the only thing that mattered, that if I was strong enough, I would never be vulnerable." He paused. "When I was drowning, when the water filled my lungs, I did not fear death. I feared the silence. I feared that I would die without ever knowing what it felt like to be—" "To be what?" Sophie asked softly. "Held," he finished. The word hung in the cold air, fragile and devastating. Sophie's heart twisted. She reached down, covering his large hand on her stomach with her own. She didn't say anything. She just interlaced their fingers. Lyle let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving his massive frame. For the first time since the beach, the Alpha King wasn't guarding or commanding or fighting. He was just a man, holding on to the only thing that kept him tethered to the earth. But just as Sophie's eyes began to drift shut, Lyle stiffened. His head snapped up, pulling away from her neck. "What?" Sophie whispered, reaching for the knife she had stashed under the pillow. "Hush," Lyle commanded, his voice barely audible. "Do not move." He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the window. Outside, in the pitch-black forest, 2 yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. Then 2 more. Then a dozen. The silence of the woods was broken by the snap of a twig. "We are not alone," Lyle growled, slowly moving his body to shield hers. Chapter 9. "Sit! Down!" Sophie didn't shout, but her voice carried the sharp snap of a whip. Lyle ignored her. He paced the small perimeter of the rotting cabin floorboards like a tiger confined to a pet carrier. 3 steps turn. 3 steps turn. His energy was suffocating, filling the room with a vibrating tension that made the dust motes dance. "They are gone," Lyle growled, pausing at the window to glare at the empty forest. The eyes they had seen last night had belonged to a passing hunting party of timber wolves, regular animals, not shifters. But the adrenaline spike had left the Alpha King wired and dangerous. "I should have killed them just to be sure. They could carry my scent back to the Packlands." "They were actual wolves, Lyle. Unless your brother speaks Dr. Doolittle, I think we're safe," Sophie said, sitting on the edge of the bed, oiling her combat knife with a rag. "But you pacing a hole in the floor is going to alert every seismic sensor in California. You need to burn off that energy before you explode." Lyle turned to her, his chest heaving slightly. His shirt was unbuttoned, revealing the hard planes of muscle that were now completely healed. "I do not explode. I conquer." "Great. Go conquer that wood pile out back," Sophie suggested, pointing to the door. "Or, if you're feeling brave, you can try to conquer me." Lyle froze. A slow, arrogant grin spread across his face, transforming him from a brooding warlord into something far more sinful. "Is that a challenge, little wolf?" "It's a training exercise," Sophie corrected, standing up and tossing the rag aside. She walked past him, kicking the back door open. The morning air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. "You rely too much on your wolf strength. In human form, without your claws, you're just a brawler. Heavy. Predictable." Lyle followed her out, laughing low in his throat. Predictable? I am the apex predator. I could pin you in 3 seconds without breaking a sweat. Prove it. Sophie didn't wait. She spun on her heel, launching a high kick aimed at his head. It was a feint. Lyle took the bait, raising his forearm to block a blow that never landed. Sophie shifted her weight mid-air, dropping low and sweeping her leg across his ankles. It was a textbook takedown, executed with the speed of a viper, but Lyle was fast. He stumbled but didn't fall, catching his balance with supernatural grace. He lunged for her, his hands open to grapple. "Too slow," Sophie taunted, ducking under his massive reach. She slammed her palm into his solar plexus, using his own forward momentum against him. Lyle grunted, more in surprise than pain. He stopped holding back. He moved like a blur, closing the distance instantly. He grabbed her waist, intending to lift her off the ground. Sophie didn't fight the lift. She wrapped her legs around his torso, locked her ankles, and threw her weight backward. Gravity did the rest. They hit the dirt hard, Sophie using the leverage to flip him. For a split second, the world spun, and then the impossible happened. Lyle was on his back in the dirt. Sophie was straddling his chest, her forearm pressed against his throat, her other hand poised to strike. Silence fell over the clearing. The birds stopped singing. Lyle stared up at her. He wasn't angry. He wasn't humiliated. His pupils had blown wide, swallowing the red of his irises until his eyes were nearly black. His chest rose and fell rapidly beneath her thighs. "You," Lyle breathed, his voice rougher than sandpaper. He made no move to throw her off, though they both knew he could. He lay there, utterly surrendered to her violence. "You fight dirty." "I fight to survive," Sophie panted, a loose strand of hair falling into her eyes. She realized suddenly how compromising their position was. She could feel the hard ridge of his arousal pressing against her, the heat of his body soaking through her jeans. "Dead kings don't have rules, Lyle." He reached up, not to choke her, but to tuck the hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, scorching her skin. "You are not a lifeguard," he whispered, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. "You are a warrior, a queen who bites." Sophie scrambled off him, her face burning. "Don't get used to it. Next time, I charge for the lesson." Chapter 10. The adrenaline from the sparring match had faded, leaving a heavy, quiet intimacy in the cabin. They sat on the floor opposite each other, sharing a can of cold peaches Sophie had found in the emergency stash. It wasn't exactly a royal banquet, but Lyle ate it like it was ambrosia. "Why?" Sophie asked, breaking the silence. She watched him lick syrup from his thumb, trying to ignore the way her stomach flipped at the sight. "Your brother, Corvick. Why did he do it?" Lyle stopped eating. The playfulness from the yard vanished, replaced by a dark, brooding shadow that made him look older. He set the can down and leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "Because I let him," Lyle said, his voice void of emotion. Corvick was always the second son, the beta. He was strong, but he lacked the brutality required to hold the throne. I thought I was protecting him by keeping him in my shadow. I thought I was being a good brother. "And he resented you for it," Sophie guessed softly. "He hated me for it," Lyle corrected, opening his eyes. They were filled with ancient regret. He didn't want protection. He wanted power. He smiled at my coronation. He toasted my victories, and all the while he was poisoning my council. He convinced them that I was a tyrant who would lead our kind into exposure and war with humans. "Are you?" Sophie asked. "A tyrant?" Lyle looked at her. "I am a king, Sophie. I make the hard choices so others can sleep. I have executed traitors. I have crushed rebellions. But I never wanted war. I wanted order." He laughed bitterly. "And my arrogance blinded me. I didn't smell the silver in the wine that night because Corvick poured it. I didn't see the knife because it was in my brother's hand." Sophie looked at the invincible monster she had saved. He wasn't a god. He was just a man who had loved his family and paid the price for it. "He missed one thing," Sophie said, leaning forward. "And what is that?" "He didn't double tap," she said with a fierce grin. "Rookie mistake. Never leave the enemy alive to hold a grudge." Lyle chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. "You are bloodthirsty. I adore it." "I'm practical. There's a difference." "Sophie," Lyle said, his tone shifting. He reached across the space between them, his hand hovering over hers. "When we retake the capital, I do not want you to stand behind me. I want you beside me. Not because of the bond, but because you are the only one who sees me and does not tremble." Sophie's breath hitched. This wasn't a command. It was an invitation. And for the first time in 5 years, the lonely, rogue part of her soul wanted to say yes. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps admit that she didn't hate the idea as much as she should. Crack. The sound wasn't thunder. It was the distinct, sharp snap of a high-velocity rifle round shattering the silence of the forest. The window above Lyle's head exploded inward in a shower of glass. "Down!" Lyle roared, launching himself at Sophie. He tackled her to the floorboards, just as a second bullet shredded the wood where she had been sitting a second ago. He covered her body with his massive frame, shielding her completely. "They found us!" Sophie gasped, the smell of gunpowder drifting in on the cold wind. "No," Lyle growled, his eyes flashing feral red as a howl erupted from the tree line. Not a timber wolf this time, but the terrifying, multi-chord shriek of a shifter hunting party. "They didn't find us. They found you." Chapter 11. The floorboards disintegrated under the impact of the door being kicked off its hinges. "Stay down!" Lyle roared, his body a living shield over Sophie, as splinters and drywall turned into shrapnel. "Get off me!" Sophie shouted, shoving at his massive chest with her elbow. "I can't shoot if I'm flattened like a pancake." She wiggled out from under the Alpha King just as a wolf the size of a black bear lunged through the gaping hole where the front door used to be. It was a shifter, fully turned, its jaws snapping inches from Lyle's face. Lyle didn't shift. He didn't have time. He caught the wolf in midair, his hands gripping its throat, and slammed it into the wall with enough force to crack the structural beams. The cabin groaned, dust raining down like snow. "Back door!" Sophie yelled, scrambling to her feet. She didn't run away. She ran toward her duffel bag. 2 more wolves crashed through the shattered window. They weren't interested in the king. They were looking at her. To Corvick's hit squad, she was just the human weakness, the soft underbelly of the Alpha. Big mistake. Sophie ripped the zipper open and grabbed her Sig Sauer. She didn't use standard lead. Bang, bang. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space. The first wolf yelped, a high-pitched sound of shock, and collapsed, clutching its leg. Smoke rose from the wound. "Silver!" Lyle bellowed, tossing the first wolf out into the yard like a bag of trash. He looked at her, eyes wide with a mix of horror and admiration. "You carry silver rounds?" "I'm a rogue, living in a city full of predators, Lyle," Sophie yelled, racking the slide. "I have trust issues. Now duck!" She fired over his shoulder, catching a third attacker who was trying to flank him. The wolf howled and retreated, the burning metal doing its job. For a moment, they were a perfect team. Lyle was the sledgehammer, breaking bones and throwing bodies. Sophie was the scalpel, precise and lethal, keeping the perimeter clear. But there were too many of them. "We need to move to the woods," Lyle commanded, grabbing a chair and smashing it over the head of an attacker. "The cabin is a trap!" "My security deposit is definitely gone," Sophie muttered, backing toward the rear exit. She turned to clear the path, raising her weapon. She didn't see the one that had climbed onto the roof. The ceiling tiles above her gave way. A gray blur dropped directly onto her. "Sophie!" Lyle's scream tore his throat raw. She reacted on instinct, throwing her arm up to protect her neck. The wolf's teeth sank into her forearm. The pain was blinding, white-hot and nauseating. She didn't scream. She swore, jamming the barrel of her gun into the wolf's ribs and pulling the trigger. The wolf went limp, dead weight on top of her. Sophie shoved the carcass off, gasping, clutching her bleeding arm. "I'm okay. She looked up. Lyle wasn't looking at the dead wolf. He was staring at the blood dripping from her fingertips onto the dirty floor. The air in the room changed. It didn't just get cold. It vanished. The vacuum of power that erupted from Lyle was so intense it shattered the remaining window glass. "They spilled your blood," Lyle whispered. The human intelligence in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a void of absolute, unthinking violence. His bones cracked, his spine arched, clothes shredded as muscles expanded instantly, fur erupting from his skin. It wasn't the controlled shift of a king. It was the explosive release of a monster. A massive, midnight black wolf stood where the man had been. It was twice the size of the attackers. It threw its head back and let out a roar that shook the earth, a sound that promised not just death, but annihilation. Chapter 12. The forest was silent. Not the peaceful silence of nature, but the terrified silence of a graveyard after a massacre. Sophie sat with her back against the damp stone wall of a shallow cave a mile from the cabin. She was pressing a torn strip of her flannel shirt against her forearm. The bleeding had slowed, but it throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. At the mouth of the cave, the beast paced. Lyle, or what was currently wearing Lyle's skin, was agitated. He was a nightmare of shadow and muscle, his black fur matted with blood that wasn't his. He hadn't shifted back. He had been stuck in this form for an hour, prowling back and forth, growling at the wind, snapping at falling leaves. His red eyes were fixed on the tree line, daring anything to move. He was guarding her. But he was also lost to the instinct. "Hey," Sophie said softly. Her voice sounded thin in the cavern. "Cujo, you're making me dizzy." The massive head whipped around. He snarled at her, baring teeth the size of daggers. It was a warning. Stay back. Dangerous. Sophie didn't stay back. She pushed herself up, wincing as her arm protested. She walked slowly toward him. The wolf crouched, ears flattened. He rumbled a low threat, his body vibrating with tension. He was terrified he would hurt her, terrified the enemy was still there, terrified of the smell of her blood. "Knock it off," Sophie said, stopping inches from his muzzle. She didn't flinch. She looked straight into the glowing red eyes. "You killed them all, Lyle. They're dead. We're safe. But if you keep growling at me, I'm going to get a rolled-up newspaper." The wolf blinked. The feral haze receded just a fraction, human confusion filtering through. Sophie reached out with her good hand. The wolf flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, she buried her fingers in the thick ruff of fur around his neck. It was coarse and warm. "Good boy," she whispered, scratching behind his ear. A shudder went through the massive beast. The growl died in his throat, replaced by a pitiful whine. He leaned into her touch, his heavy head dropping until it rested against her stomach. He was the king of monsters, the most feared creature on the continent, and he was currently nuzzling her like a golden retriever who had been caught chewing the sofa. "You're a mess," she murmured, resting her chin on his head. "But you saved me." The wolf sniffed the air. He smelled the iron tang of her blood. He pulled back, chuffing softly, and nudged her injured arm with his wet nose. "It's fine," Sophie said, trying to pull away. "Just a scratch. I'll need stitches, but I've had worse." The wolf didn't listen. He extended a tongue, rough like wet sandpaper, and licked the wound. Sophie hissed at the sting, but then the sensation turned cool. A tingling numbness spread through her arm. Shifter saliva. It wasn't a cure-all, but for a fated mate, it accelerated clotting and prevented infection. It was the most primal form of care a wolf could offer. He licked the wound clean, his movements incredibly gentle for a creature capable of crushing skulls. When he was finished, he looked up at her, his eyes soft. Then, the sound of cracking bones returned. Sophie looked away. Shifting was never pretty to watch. When the sound stopped, she threw her spare jacket over the figure kneeling on the cave floor. Lyle pulled the jacket around his shoulders. He was shivering, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He looked up at her, wiping a smear of dirt from his face. He looked wrecked, vulnerable. "I lost control," he rasped, his voice wrecked. I could have hurt you." "You didn't," Sophie said, sliding down the wall to sit next to him. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You protected me. That's what partners do." Lyle went still. He turned his head slowly to look at her. "Partners?" "Don't let it go to your head," Sophie mumbled, closing her eyes as exhaustion finally dragged her under. "But yeah, partners. Now shut up and let me sleep. If I dream about wolves, I'm suing you." Lyle didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into the heat of his body, and watched the entrance of the cave, daring the world to try and take her from him again. Chapter 13. The Resistance headquarters looked less like a command center for a rebellion and more like a place where health inspectors went to die. It was the basement of a defunct meatpacking plant on the outskirts of San Francisco. The air smelled of old copper and wet concrete. Lyle strode through the rusted blast doors as if he were walking into a palace, his hand firmly on the small of Sophie's back. Inside, 20 wolves stopped talking instantly. They were a rough crew, scars, tattoos, and the heavy, anxious energy of soldiers who knew they were losing a war. In the center of the room stood Clara, Lyle's former beta. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, his face gray with exhaustion. "You're alive," Clara breathed, dropping the map he was holding. The room erupted in murmurs, relief, awe. Then, Clara sniffed the air. His nose wrinkled. "And you brought a pet?" Clara looked at Sophie with the kind of disdain usually reserved for a termite infestation. "Lyle, we are planning a counter-coup, not a trip to the beach. Why does she smell like sunscreen and human weakness?" Lyle's growl was instantaneous, a low rumble that vibrated the metal tables. "Careful, Clara. She is my mate." "She is a liability!" Clara shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Corvick has a witch. He has an army, and you bring a rogue girl who probably faints at the sight of blood? She will get us all killed!" The room went silent. All eyes turned to Sophie. They expected her to cower behind the big, bad king. Sophie sighed, handed her purse to Lyle, and walked up to Clara. He towered over her, sneering. "You think I'm a liability because I don't smell like wet dog?" Sophie asked calmly. "I think you're a distraction," Clara spat, stepping into her personal space to intimidate her. "Go wait in the car, girl. The men are talking." Sophie didn't blink. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a combat knife from the table next to them. Before Clara could even process the movement, she kicked the back of his knee, forcing him to buckle. As he dropped, she spun behind him, wrapped her arm around his throat, and pressed the cold steel of the blade against his jugular. It took less than 2 seconds. Clara was on his knees, gasping, with a rogue human holding his life in her hands. "Listen to me, Beta," Sophie whispered into his ear, her voice sickly sweet. "I dragged your king out of the ocean. I dug a silver bullet out of his shoulder with tweezers. I killed 3 of Corvick's hit squad yesterday while you were hiding in this basement playing Risk. So, unless you want to find out just how much blood I can stand, I suggest you lower your tone." She released him and shoved him forward. Clara stumbled, rubbing his throat, looking at her with wide, terrified eyes. Sophie slammed the knife back onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She turned to Lyle, who was watching her with a look of pure, unadulterated worship. "Okay," Sophie said, dusting off her hands. "Now that we've established the hierarchy, let's talk about how we're going to crash this party." Clara cleared his throat, standing up slowly. He didn't look at Lyle. He looked at Sophie, and this time, he dipped his head in respect. "The coronation gala is tomorrow night. The palace is locked down. Thermal sensors, scent trackers. Entering is suicide." "Good," Lyle said, stepping up beside Sophie and resting a heavy hand on her shoulder. "I have always enjoyed suicide missions. It makes the victory sweeter." Chapter 14. "I hate this," Sophie muttered, staring at herself in the cracked mirror of the safe house bathroom. "I feel like a sausage in a silk casing." "You look..." Lyle's voice trailed off from the doorway. Sophie turned around. She was wearing a midnight blue gown that Clara's team had stolen, from a nearby boutique. It was backless, sleeveless, and had a slit that went dangerously high up her thigh. It fit her like a second skin, accentuating curves she usually hid under oversized lifeguard hoodies. Lyle was standing in the doorframe, wearing a tuxedo that strained across his broad shoulders. He looked devastatingly handsome. James Bond, if James Bond could turn into a giant wolf and eat people. But he wasn't looking at his own reflection. He was staring at Sophie with a hunger that made her knees weak. "You look lethal," he finished, his voice rough. He walked into the room, his eyes darkening. "I do not want to take you out there. I want to lock this door and keep you here where no one else can see you." "Focus, Your Highness," Sophie said, swatting his hand away as he reached for her waist. "We have a kingdom to steal." She bent down, ignoring his sharp intake of breath, and hiked up the dress to strap a ceramic knife to her inner thigh. "Ceramic. Won't trip the metal detectors. And I have a canister of pepper spray in my clutch." "Pepper spray?" Lyall raised an eyebrow. "You intend to season our enemies." "It's concentrated capsaicin, Lyall. For a wolf with a nose 10,000 times more sensitive than a human's, it's basically a chemical weapon. Trust me." They left the safe house in a black sedan with tinted windows. The drive to the Alpha Palace was tense. The city lights blurred past, reflecting in Lyall's stoic eyes. He was holding her hand so tight his knuckles were white. The palace was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the bay. Dozens of valets were parking luxury cars. The air smelled of expensive perfume and treachery. "Ready?" Lyall asked as the car stopped. "Showtime," Sophie breathed. They stepped out. The silence that rippled through the crowd was immediate. Guests froze, champagne flutes halfway to their mouths. They weren't staring at the dress. They were staring at the ghost. Lyall Tala, the dead king, was walking up the red carpet, alive, unscarred, and radiating enough power to flatten the entire city block. And on his arm was a woman who walked not like a consort, but like a predator. Lyall didn't look at the guests. He stared straight ahead at the massive double doors. The guards at the entrance, wearing Corvix insignia, went pale. They didn't even reach for their weapons. Instinct overrode orders. They stepped aside, heads bowed, trembling. They entered the grand ballroom. It was a sea of gold and velvet. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat Corvic Tala. He was laughing with a witch in red robes, a crown resting on the table next to his wine glass. The music didn't stop because the band realized what was happening. It stopped because the air pressure in the room dropped so sharply the violin strings snapped. Lyall stopped in the center of the dance floor. He released Sophie's hand, though he stayed close enough to touch. Corvic slowly stood up. His face went from jovial to chalk white. "Brother," Lyall's voice boomed, amplified by nothing but sheer alpha dominance. It reached every corner of the silent hall. "You are sitting in my chair." Corvic's eyes darted to the guards lining the walls. He licked his lips, recovering his composure. A cruel, twisted smile spread across his face as he looked from Lyall to Sophie. "I see you brought a date to your funeral, Lyall," Corvic sneered, raising his hand. "Close the doors." The massive blast doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom, sealing them in. The lock clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound of finality. "You didn't think I'd leave the front door open without a trap, did you?" Corvic laughed. He snapped his fingers at the witch in red. "Now." Chapter 15. The air in the ballroom didn't just grow heavy, it turned into lead. The witch in the red robes slammed her staff against the marble floor. It made a sound like a cracking femur, sharp and nauseating. A ripple of crimson energy distorted the air, spreading out from the dais like a shockwave. It passed harmlessly through the terrified guests, through the tables, and through Sophie. But when it hit Lyall, it crushed him. The Alpha King, who had fought off a hit squad while bleeding out from silver poisoning, let out a strangled gasp. His knees hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud. He clawed at his throat, veins bulging in his neck as if an invisible garrote were being tightened by a giant's hand. "Lyle!" Sophie lunged for him, grabbing his shoulders. His skin was burning hot, vibrating with a chaotic energy. "Run!" he rasped, blood trickling from his nose. "Sophie, run!" "Oh, no one is running," Corvick drawled, descending the steps of the dais with the casual swagger of a man who had rigged the game. He stopped a few feet away, sipping his wine. "The suppression hex. Ancient stuff. Nasty. It targets the alpha bloodline specifically. The stronger the alpha, the heavier the weight. Right now, my dear brother feels like he's carrying the entire palace on his back." Lyle roared, a defiant, wet sound, and tried to stand. The witch muttered a harsh syllable, and the red light flared. Lyle was slammed back down, cracking the marble tile beneath his knees. Sophie looked around. The guards were closing in, weapons drawn. The guests were cowering against the walls. She looked at the witch, who was deep in a trance, maintaining the spell. She looked at Corvick, who was smiling at her like she was a prize at a carnival. "Don't worry, darling," Corvick said, stepping closer to Sophie. He reached out to touch her face. "I won't kill you. Lyle has terrible taste in politics, but excellent taste in women. You'll make a fine addition to my kennel. Once we break that bond, of course." Sophie slapped his hand away. The sound echoed in the silent room. "Touch me again, and you lose the fingers," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Corvick laughed, a cold, barking sound. "Feisty. I like that. Guards, kill the king. Take the girl to the breeding wing." 4 guards stepped forward, raising silver-tipped spears. Lyle looked up at Sophie, his red eyes filled with devastating apology. He couldn't move. He couldn't shift. He was going to die watching them take her. "I'm sorry," he mouthed. Sophie looked at the guards. Then she looked at the witch. She realized something Corvick had overlooked. The hex targeted alpha blood. It targeted pack connections. It targeted magic. Sophie Rollin was a rogue. She had cut her ties to the magic of the packs years ago. To this spell, she was nothing more than a human in a dress, a ghost in the machine. "You forgot one thing, Corvick," Sophie said, reaching for the clutch purse she had clamped under her arm. "And what is that?" Corvick sneered. "I'm not a wolf," she said, popping the clasp. "I'm a lifeguard, and I really hate bullies." Corvick didn't see the canister until it was too late. Sophie whipped the pepper spray out of her clutch and depressed the trigger in a sweeping arc. This wasn't the weak gas station variety. This was law enforcement-grade, concentrated capsaicin gel designed to stop 250-pound aggressive men. Against wolves with olfactory senses 10,000 times more sensitive than a human's, it was the equivalent of a chemical nuke. "Ah!" Corvick screamed, clawing at his eyes as the red gel coated his face. He fell back, colliding with 2 of his guards, who were instantly incapacitated, hacking and gagging as the spicy mist filled their noses. Sophie didn't stop to admire her work. She kicked off her high heels. She wasn't fighting for honor. She was fighting for time. She sprinted toward the dais. The witch's eyes snapped open. She saw the threat coming. A woman in a blue dress running barefoot across the marble with a ceramic knife in her hand. The witch raised her staff to redirect the spell, to crush Sophie like she was crushing Lyle. Too slow.
Sophie slid on her knees across the polished floor, the friction burning her skin, ducking under the blast of red energy that scorched the air above her head. She used her momentum to slash the ceramic blade across the witch's Achilles tendon. The witch shrieked, the staff clattering to the floor as she collapsed. The red light vanished instantly. Behind Sophie,
The sound of a vacuum sealing shut echoed through the room. Then, a roar. It wasn't the pained groan of a dying man. It was the thunderous, earth-shaking bellow of an alpha reclaiming his power. Sophie scrambled to her feet, turning around just in time to see Lyle rise. He didn't stand up. He launched himself. He hit the remaining two guards with the force of a freight train, snapping their spears like toothpicks. He didn't even shift. He didn't need to. He picked one guard up by the throat and threw him through a banquet table filled with ice sculptures. "Sophie!" Lyle shouted, scanning the chaos for her. "I'm good!" she yelled back, grabbing a silver platter to deflect a shard of glass flying her way. "Finish him!" Lyle turned to Corvick. The usurper was stumbling, eyes streaming tears, skin red and blistering from the pepper spray. He tried to shift, his bones cracking, fur sprouting in patches, but he was blind and panicked. Lyle caught him by the lapels of his tuxedo and slammed him into the stone pillar of the dais. The impact shook the chandeliers. "You wanted my throne?" Lyle growled, his face inches from his brother's. "You wanted my crown? Take it!" He headbutted Corvick. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly loud. Corvick slumped to the floor, unconscious, his half-shifted form twitching. The room went deadly silent. The guests were pressed against the walls, terrified. The remaining guards dropped their weapons, recognizing that the tide had turned. Lyle stood over his brother, chest heaving. He slowly turned to look at Sophie. She was standing on the dais, barefoot, holding a ceramic knife, her hair wild, standing over the groaning witch. He walked toward her. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He stepped up onto the platform, ignoring the unconscious witch and his defeated brother. He stopped in front of Sophie, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "You," he breathed, reaching out to touch her cheek with a trembling hand. "You pepper-sprayed the High Council." "It was effective," Sophie said, trying to catch her breath. "Also, you're welcome." Lyle didn't smile. He grabbed the back of her neck and pulled her forehead against his. "I thought I lost you." "You almost did," she whispered. "Next time, we stick to the plan." The plan was... Lyle cut off. His eyes widened. He spun Sophie around, placing his body between her and the balcony above them. Crack! A single shot rang out from the shadows of the upper tier. A sniper, loyal to the end. Lyle jerked violently, a bloom of red appearing on his chest, right over his heart. But he didn't fall. He just looked down at the wound, then up at the balcony, his eyes glowing with an annoyance that was almost comical. "Really?" he sighed, as the silver bullet began to push itself out of his chest, rejected by the sheer magnitude of his power now that the hex was gone. "I just bought this suit." Sophie, however, wasn't looking at the suit. She was looking at the sniper. And for the first time that night, the fierce, controlled lifeguard snapped. She snatched a heavy golden goblet from the table and hurled it with quarterback precision at the shadows. A yelp followed, and a body tumbled over the railing, crashing into the buffet table below. "That," Sophie announced to the terrified room, is the last interruption I am accepting tonight. Chapter 17. The sound of 1,000 knees hitting the floor was louder than the gunshot had been. It started with the guards. The moment Corvick hit the ground, his face a ruin of bruises and pepper spray gel, the loyalty in the room shifted like the tide. Weapons clattered to the marble. Heads bowed. Necks were bared in the universal sign of submission to the Alpha. Sophie stood on the dais, panting, clutching the silver platter she had used as a shield. She watched as the wave of submission spread. The politicians, the wealthy donors, the pack elders who had sipped wine while Corvick sat on the throne, they all dropped. It was impressive. It was ancient. And to Sophie, it was nauseating. Hypocrites, she muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. Every single one of them. Lyle didn't look at the crowd. He was looking at the hole in his tuxedo jacket. He touched the skin beneath, fully healed, then looked up at the ceiling and let out a roar. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was a sonic boom of claiming. It rattled the crystals in the chandeliers and vibrated in the marrow of every shifter in the room. It was the Alpha King announcing to the world, to the city, and to the stars that he was back. The crowd responded with a collective, reverent whimper. Clara, the beta who had doubted Sophie, was the first to rush the stage. He stepped over Corvick's unconscious body as if it were a rug. "My king!" Clara shouted, his face flushed with victory. "The perimeter is secure. The traitors are being rounded up. The council is ready to receive your orders." Suddenly, Lyle was swarmed. Advisors, generals, and sycophants pressed in, creating a wall of black tuxedos and expensive perfume around him. They touched his arms, kissed his ring, begged for mercy, and offered excuses. "Lyle!" Sophie called out, but her voice was swallowed by the cacophony of adoration. She took a step toward him, but a wall of guards, Lyle's loyal guards now, stepped in front of her. They didn't block her out of malice. They blocked her out of protocol. The king was secure. The threat was neutralized. The civilian was no longer needed. Sophie stopped. She watched Lyle through the gaps in the crowd. He was taller than everyone else, his face hard, his eyes scanning the room. He looked regal, terrifying. He belonged to this world of violence and politics. She looked down at her bare feet, dirty from the run. She looked at the pepper spray canister in her hand. "I saved the man," she whispered to herself, a cold realization settling in her gut. "But I can't save the king." The bond pulled at her chest, a frantic tug urging her to go to him, to claw through the crowd and claim her mate. But Sophie Rollin hadn't survived 5 years as a rogue by ignoring reality. She was a lifeguard. She pulled people out of the water, resuscitated them, and then watched them walk away. That was the job. She dropped the silver platter. It clattered loudly, but no one heard it over the chanting of, "Long live the king!" Sophie turned around. She didn't run. She walked. She walked past the unconscious Corvick, past the kneeling guests, and slipped out the side service door into the cool, foggy San Francisco night. The silence of the alleyway was deafening. "Taxi!" she yelled at a passing cab, waving her hand. Inside the ballroom, Lyle finally shoved Clara aside, his eyes wild as he searched the dais. "Sophie!" he roared, the panic in his voice cutting through the celebration. But the only answer was the swinging of the service door, slowly settling back into place. Chapter 18. 2 weeks later, the Pacific Ocean looked exactly the same, which Sophie found personally offensive. She sat in Tower 4, staring at the horizon. The sun was shining, the tourists were burning, and the water was a sparkling, inviting blue. It was a perfect day. It was miserable. "You're sighing again," her coworker Dave called out from the sand below. "You sound like a deflating tire. What is wrong with you? You took 2 weeks of vacation and came back looking like you attended a funeral for a puppy." "I'm contemplating the futility of existence, Dave," Sophie called back, adjusting her sunglasses. "Go yell at that kid for feeding the seagulls." She picked up her binoculars. Routine. Scan left, scan right. Check the rip current. Ignore the gaping hole in her chest where her heart used to be. The bond sickness hadn't come back physically, probably because Lyle was alive and healthy, but the emotional ache was constant. It was a dull throb, a phantom limb syndrome of the soul. She had expected him to come for her the first day, then the second. By the 10th day, she realized that kings had kingdoms to rebuild, and lifeguards had rent to pay. "Target at 12 o'clock, she muttered to herself, focusing the lenses on a figure walking down the beach. She frowned. The beach was full of people in swimwear, but this guy was wearing a suit? No, not a suit. He was wearing board shorts. Bright, floral, neon orange board shorts that looked like they had been bought at a hallucinogenic airport gift shop, and a tight black t-shirt that was struggling to contain muscles that had no business being that large. Sophie lowered the binoculars. Her heart stopped, then restarted at double speed. People were moving out of his way, not bowing, just instinctively parting like water around a shark. He walked with a predator's grace, sand kicking up around his heels, heading straight for Tower 4. Lyle stopped at the base of the ladder. He looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. He looked ridiculous. He looked magnificent. "Permission to come aboard?" he called up, his deep voice carrying over the crash of the waves. Sophie gripped the railing. "You look like a traffic cone, Lyle." "I was told this is local camouflage," he said, climbing the ladder. The wood creaked ominously under his weight. He pulled himself onto the small platform, filling the space instantly. The scent of him, ocean, pine, and power, hit her harder than the actual ocean spray. He wasn't wearing his crown. He wasn't wearing his armor. He was just Lyle. "You left," he said simply. No anger, just a quiet observation. "I didn't fit in the picture," Sophie said, refusing to look at him, staring stubbornly at the water. "You had a room full of people kneeling." I was barefoot and holding a condiment bottle. "I didn't hear them," Lyle said, stepping closer. "I roared for you, Sophie, and when I looked down, you were gone." "I'm a rogue, Lyle. I don't do palaces. I don't do politics. I save lives, and then I go home to my studio apartment and eat cereal." "I hate the palace," Lyle admitted. Sophie looked at him then. "What?" "It's cold, it's drafty, and the staff is afraid to look me in the eye," Lyle said, resting his hip against the railing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It wasn't a ring. It was her ceramic knife. "I have spent the last 2 weeks executing traitors and restructuring the council. I have secured the borders. The kingdom is safe." "Good for you," Sophie whispered. "It is meaningless," Lyle said. He dropped the knife on the bench and took her hands. His skin was warm, grounding her. "I sat on the throne, Sophie, and all I could think about was a freezing motel room and a woman who fought me for the blanket. Lyle, I am not here to command you, he said softly, lowering his head until their foreheads touched. I am done giving orders to you. I am asking. My life is mine again, but it is empty. Come with me. Not as a subject, not as a queen to sit and look pretty. Come as my partner. Make fun of my decisions, threaten my generals, pepper spray my enemies. Sophie laughed, a choked, wet sound. You're asking me to leave my job? Lyle looked down at the chaotic beach, then back at her. Sophie, you saved the Alpha King. I think you're overqualified for this. She looked at him, the fierce, terrifying monster who wore neon shorts because he thought it would make her smile. I do hate this tower, she admitted. Then leave it, Lyle murmured, his lips brushing hers. Sophie reached up, grabbed the whistle around her neck, and ripped it off. She tossed it over the railing. It landed in the sand with a mute thud. Okay, she whispered. But I'm driving. Lyle roared with laughter, sweeping her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He didn't climb down the ladder, he jumped, landing in the sand with a heavy thud that made the tourists gasp. Put me down! Sophie shrieked, laughing. Never, Lyle growled, turning toward the parking lot, walking away from the ocean that had brought them together. He looked down at the woman in his arms, his red eyes glowing with absolute certainty. Mine. Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck, resting her head on his shoulder. Yours, she answered,